Hey everyone, it is Thursday, January 2, 2014, and right now we're going to talk about the year that was, the year that will be, and everything we loved so much about it. This is the iMore Show. Joining me as always, a whole new year, we have the managing editor of iMore, Mr. Peter Cohen. How are you, Peter?
I am fine, sir. Thank you. How are you?
Happy New Year.
Happy New Year.
So Allie is in Paris, I think, today. Tough life.
Yes, indeed. She is. She has been gallivanting around Europe for the last several days, and it seems like she's having a wonderful time.
She's in search of Hogwarts, and I don't know quite how that's going to work out for her.
She's not going to find it in Paris. I know that much.
And Richard Devine, who's usually here with us, is already on his way to CES. We're going to be at CES all next week, and apparently it takes several days to get there from England.
You guys are going to be at CES. Meanwhile, I'm going to be home in my jammies laughing at all of you.
I was talking about that with an editor from a site that we both know, but shall remain nameless, about how you guys get to sit there basically next to the heater with a warm adult beverage in your hands and sort of laugh at us as we get whatever disease is floating around the show floor this year.
You know, I remain a CES virgin. I have never been to CES, and of all the trade events that I'm familiar with, CES is the one that I am absolutely the least interested in attending. So thank you very much, Rene, for taking one for the team.
Well, so there's a couple things. One is it's the only real time of the year that all of the Mobile Nations editors are there, like Crackberry, Android Central. So we take it as a time to do like our planning sessions and our meetings. So I have to go regardless of what actual iMore content is there. But this year we're also doing CES Live. We're teaming up with GeekBeat because we did Talk Mobile with them, and we did BlackBerry Live, and we did Samsung Live with them. So we're going to try CES Live, and we have I think 24 people from our side, maybe a dozen from their side, and we will be broadcasting, I think, 5 or 6 hours a day every day next week, Peter.
That's going to be amazing, and hopefully it'll give people a better sense of what's actually happening at CES, because you know the signal-to-noise ratio at that event is really difficult to sort of dig through sometimes.
Georgia says she's going to be hunting for robots.
Okay. Like killer robots or just household robots? What kind of robots?
I don't know, but one of our peoples that will not turn out very well for.
Right, indeed, yeah.
So kind of before we get started on what is going to be, I want to look back a little bit, and I'm sure you have your own ideas, but the stories that stuck out the most for me, last year the big thing for me was Tim Cook's Apple. When Tim Cook came in and he said, I'm going to do to Apple management what Steve Jobs did to Apple products. I'm going to make a grid, and I'm going to fit one person in each square, and we're going to have software and hardware, we're going to have design, and we're going to have technology. And then he had, you know, Bob Mansfield and Craig Federighi and Johnny Ive, and I'm forgetting one. Not Phil Schiller, Eddie Q, or whomever, yeah, whoever he filled those things out. And that did a lot because it put everything, it coordinated everything, OS X and iOS, under the same sort of leadership, and it resulted in Scott Forstall leaving. And my sense of that, Peter, is that Scott Forstall had become the best person in the world at channeling the taste and vision of Steve Jobs. But in an Apple without Steve Jobs, that is no longer a great skill to have. And where maybe once Steve Jobs drowned out every voice, when that's gone, the other voices become very loud. And what was previously a really harmonious relationship between Steve and Scott became a disharmonious relationship when Steve was no longer part of that partnership.
Well, the tales that we've been told out of school are that even though Steve and Scott may have had a very harmonious relationship, Scott never had a harmonious relationship with the other people that he worked with, and in fact was a very difficult manager and a very difficult coworker. So I don't think it should be anybody's surprise that Forstall was shown the door ultimately. But you're right. You know, Tim Cook made his mark on Apple management in 2013, and in fact, you know, laid the groundwork for that in late 2012. So this has been the first year of Tim sort of running the ship his own way, I think. And you know, the evidence is strong that he is doing a great job of doing that, continuing into 2014.
And one of the things that I liked is Johnny Ive previously did just hardware design, but this is the first year we got to see the results of him dipping his toe into software design. And he basically, at the very end of 2012, he had a meeting, he got everyone from Apple involved, and he pitched his vision of iOS. And it makes sense that they're starting with iOS because it is still it is their highest revenue generating operating system. But it's kind of scary because it also has hundreds of millions. It has like the Windows problem, hundreds of millions of users that you have to navigate. And his vision was as clean and clear as his hardware had been, but it also had stuff like the depth, the Gaussian blur, the parallax scrolling, the physics engine, the particle engine. And he could envision the stuff, but it was a tremendous amount of work for Apple's engineers to actually get things like the floating icons working.
Indeed, and people have responded to that in various ways. The vast majority of users who have eligible devices have switched over to iOS 7 already. There's a fairly small percentage of people left over at the end of 2013 who were still using iOS 6 or iOS 6 on their devices if they could upgrade to 7. That's partly because Apple sort of forced their hand to do it, but the changes, although I think abrupt for some users initially, were really kind of a continuous flow from what they expected. People were a little bit taken aback by some of the user interface enhancements that Johnny Ive introduced with iOS 7, but in the end, iOS 7 is still iOS. Fundamentally, the act of using these features and these apps on this device haven't changed that dramatically that people had to relearn a new vocabulary all over again.
Yeah, I think that's hugely important that everything was spatially consistent. Like your phone icon was still where your phone icon, was supposed to be, and your Safari icon, it looked different, but it was still in the same place, and it still did similar things. I think the repercussion was, though, that they typically had 12 months to sort of work on an iOS version, and for iOS 5 they had 16 months, which is a lot of time. And granted, they did iCloud as well, but that's still a pretty hefty amount of time. But going from late November, late December, going towards WWDC to get the beta ready, that is not, even for a normal operating system release, that is not a lot of time. And when you are redesigning every pixel on the screen and you're creating all these new behaviors and this entirely new design language, it's no time at all. And I think we saw that because of how early the beta was for WWDC and how the iPad version still wasn't ready. And I think we see that now. And you did a great piece earlier in the year, cautioning people about iOS 7. But I think it's incredibly impressive to me that Apple was able to get it done. But I'm still waiting for it to feel like a finished product.
Yeah, I am too, and I think it's coming in fits and starts. I mean, Apple has already introduced, since iOS 7 was released, some incremental updates that have improved things a little bit for users, and will continue to do so. And we're going to see more point updates to iOS 7 going forward. But I think the big transition Apple's turned the corner with, and they deserve a lot of credit for being able to turn something around so quickly, because God knows we've seen enough mobile technology companies sort of sputter and stop when they've had to make transitions like this before. I mean, it took Microsoft a long time to get Windows Phone where it was usable and different from what was there before. BlackBerry in many ways is still struggling with that transition. And Android has its problems too in terms of trying to get any sort of consistent usable operating system and user experience with all the myriad devices that are available to it, and the fragmentation that goes on in that ecosystem as well. So it was a Herculean task for Apple to do, and it's amazing that they've done it as consistently and quickly as they have.
Yeah, I agree. I'm also happy that even though they're such a huge company, even though they're now dealing with this Windows size user base problem, that they're still an audacious company, that they're still not change averse, that they're willing to do this, even though it will be a shock to a lot of their users. And of course, there's pros and cons that come with that. And we've seen people be horribly change adverse. We've seen, traditional BlackBerry users have not taken to BlackBerry 10 the amount we thought they would. Windows users have said, "Where's our start button? Give us back our start button." And Apple has made a few concessions. They're letting you reduce the motion. They're letting you turn on, an iOS 7.1. They're going to let you do several things to try and make it more comfortable for some people who were shocked by it. But I like that they're not slowing down, and they went. Prior to iOS 7, they had the oldest mobile operating system, which is crazy because it launched in 2007, but everybody else had rebooted. And I think in the span of 8 months, they managed to completely refresh that product line, and that, I think, is almost unprecedented.
Indeed it is. And I mean, that also explains why, in many respects, Mavericks went untouched, because that's Apple's other big operating system release in 2013. They didn't just do iOS 7, they also released a brand new version of OS 10. And in many ways, OS 10 is in all ways, OS 10 is a much more mild change. In fact, so much so that I think a lot of critics initially were very critical of Mavericks because they were expecting to be wowed with something that just never came. But you can only expect Apple's going to work its magic in so many places at once.
What was interesting to me about both of these releases, and I believe that the new backgrounding stuff was underway before Scott Forstall left. We would have gotten that either way. But even with the massive interface change, Apple still managed to create what I think is the first real true mobile form of multitasking, which is just-in-time multitasking. I think that's going to be hugely important, and everyone's going to be doing that. But moreover, with Mavericks, they did all these power user features, not least of which is all this energy-saving stuff. And there's this famous story, I think John Gruber told it, of Steve Jobs, they had this planning session, and it was the Mac's turn. They got iOS out the door, they got the iPad out the door, and it was time to figure out what they were going to do with the Mac, and they were planning to spend, a day or more talking about it. And Jobs walks in, puts an iPad on the table, presses a button, it turns on, and he says, "Why can't my Mac do that?" And it took a couple of years. It took Haswell chips from Intel, and it took Mavericks, but all of a sudden now I have a MacBook Air that's on in the blink of an eye and lasts an entire day, Peter. And we've heard from people who used to work at Apple saying, a couple of years ago, most of the stuff would never have shipped.
Right, absolutely. And with the exception of the Mac Mini, we saw every Apple product touched, or every Mac product touched in the Mac lineup. There were new Retina MacBook Pros, there were new iMacs, and there were new MacBook Airs, all of which using the new Haswell chips. The Haswell chips, have some nice performance enhancements when it comes to graphics for the desktop machines. But really, the big advantage is the incredible power conservation that they've got. So you can have that all-day battery life on a 13-inch MacBook Air, which you've never had before. And that also comes with Mavericks. They did a lot of it, although Mavericks may not be the most impressive looking update in terms of, new visual features, new stuff that really makes you go, wow. There's a lot of under-the-hood stuff there to improve efficiency. And the two of them work together to create a very elegant system that can work all day, depending on what kind of system you're using. I've certainly seen some improvements going from Mountain Lion to Mavericks on my 15-inch Retina MacBook Pro, and that thing, is not a power-stepping device by any stretch of the imagination, but I'm still getting more time out of it now than I used to, which is great.
Yeah, and and that's all under Craig Federighi now. He is in charge of both iOS and OS 10, and he has VPs under him who have a more singular focus. But I like the idea that even though these two things are not the same, and these two things will never be the same, I like the idea that there are people at Apple now who aren't as siloed. As much as we thought Apple was all one company before, they had a lot of silos. Scott Forstall was in charge of iOS, Avi Trillin, and then Bertrand Serlet, and then Craig Federighi were in charge of OS 10. And not everyone always knew what everyone else was doing. That's why we have stuff, that doesn't always work together. And I like the idea that there are these people at the top who should have better global views.
Yeah, and I think that's important. I think it's going to be increasingly important going forward because Apple's really interested in selling its users on a consistent user experience, regardless of what device they're using. And that doesn't necessarily mean that OS 10 and iOS have to work the same way, but there are certain expectations that users have of the way that their data works, for example, that iOS and OS 10 need to be able to work in tandem to provide things like being able to send maps data from my Mac to my iPhone, which I can do now, thanks to the presence of maps in Mavericks, or having two-way communication between pages, numbers, and Keynote in iOS and OS 10. That's something that up until now has been tricky and inelegant to do, and now it works much better with iTunes Cloud Syncing. So, I think that where Apple's smart, they're taking advantage of the natural synergy between those two systems, and they're exploiting it to their best ability.
So, I think you nailed several interesting things there. One is I'm not a developer and I can't speak for developers, but we haven't heard as much external griping about iCloud this year. Now, back at WWDC, Apple didn't say much about it publicly, but behind the scenes, they were super apologetic. They were asking for a second shot. They said that they were going to make this right. And I have no direct knowledge of this, but just based on the amount of stuff being written about it, either developers have moved on to post-iCloud solutions and don't worry about it anymore, or it's working at least enough that we're not being impacted by it.
I think that it's working in some cases. Developers have been able to pick and choose the situations where iCloud syncing works right for them. And where iCloud syncing works great is especially for developers that have some kind of file-based sync technology. Where it doesn't work is when you're dealing with record syncing. That's where you've got to have developers sort of rolling their own solution that works a little bit better, or just going outside of that ecosystem altogether to something else. So, you're right that we haven't heard as much griping about it because there was a big push last year to get developers using iCloud Sync. Well, they did, and they realized what a heinous
some of them regretted it.
Issue it was, and as you pointed out, moved on to something else. But there are certainly a lot of cases where iCloud Sync works exactly the way that it's supposed to and provides a really good user experience for people who either need to share files with other folks or are synchronizing files between their devices, between their iOS devices and their Mac devices.
So I guess there are two big things about iCloud this year for me. One was that on iOS now you can stream as well as download. Previously, you could only download, you could stream stuff on Apple TV, but if you wanted to watch something that you'd previously purchased on iTunes, you had to download it and then play it, which was beyond annoying. Now you can stream it. It's a little buggy. Sometimes it's hard to tell if it's actually downloaded. It doesn't report things right. You can have to go into usage and delete it. All that stuff aside, I love that I can stream from it. But the bigger news is something I haven't been able to try yet, and that was iTunes Radio. That was probably the biggest server-side announcement they had last year.
Yeah, iTunes Radio, for those of us who have been lucky enough to get our hands on it, i.e. those of us in the United States, iTunes Radio has worked out, and actually in the UK too, right? You can't get it in Canada.
Can't get it anywhere but the US still.
Oh, really? Okay,
yeah.
All right. So, it's still a U.S. exclusive thing. And why is that? Well, it's the same reason why, Apple took its own sweet time getting iTunes stores in different countries, too. It all has to do with licensing and distribution. Unfortunately, it's a big hassle. Once it comes to international customers, though, they'll get a wonderful taste of how it works. And, iTunes Radio is great. I use it on my phone quite frequently when we're out and about. And even though I've got kind of a spotty data connection to the internet sometimes through my service provider, at least in my area, I can usually still get a pretty consistent iTunes Radio stream without anything dropping out. So Apple does a very good job of buffering that stuff. And the other advantage is that if you're an iTunes Match customer, you get it without any ads, which is really kind of nice. Yeah. You just get a continuous flow of music. How it holds up against Pandora or Spotify or other streaming services is really kind of a subjective thing. Some people love iTunes Radio. Some people say that iTunes Radio's choices are maybe a little more shallow than what they'll find on Spotify. But, I think that there's room enough for everybody at the table. The advantage that Apple has with iTunes Radio is that they've immediately immediately got the user base of everybody who uses iTunes, which is millions upon millions of people. Once that iTunes radio icon goes active in iTunes, whether it's on their Mac, on their PC, or on their iOS device, it's something that they can use immediately without having to download a new client and create a new account for. That's a big deal.
I think that's absolutely a big deal. I'm eager to try it, so hopefully in 2014 we will see it rolled out further. I think the second big story, if we take iOS 7 and Apple's ability to turn on the dime and the reorg and all that as the first big story, the second one, Peter, the thing that impressed me the most is something I think you tried to get married to in at least several of your U.S. states, and that is the new Mac Pro.
Yeah, the Mac Pro. The Mac Pro we saw initially at WWDC in June, a little sneak preview with a teaser that it was going to be available later in the year. And then in October, Apple introduced some more content, some more information about it, saying that they were going to take orders in December. December rolled around, and finally around mid-month, Apple started taking orders. And right before the end of the year, Apple managed to get a few units out the door. But Apple couldn't
three or four.
3 or 4. Apple couldn't meet demand. Demand is already backordered into February or March. So, people who want them, who sat on waiting to get them, are probably going to be waiting a little while longer. But this is a really amazing machine. The Mac Pro had not really undergone any significant update since at least 2010. But really, when it comes right down to it, the box itself hadn't changed since the Power Mac G5 era. So this is something that predated Apple's switch to Intel. It went back 10 years. 2000.
It was their oldest extant design.
Absolutely, it was 2003, and it really kind of that machine harkens back to a very different era in personal computing, where there was a need for a monolithic desktop machine because that was the only machine that was powerful enough to do what the Mac Pro needed to do. But the Mac Pro is a very specialized piece of hardware. It's not a general purpose computer in the same way that a Retina MacBook Pro or an iMac is. It's a machine that is very specifically aimed at content creators who are working with digital video or pro audio, people who are working with scientific calculation, researchers, mathematicians, people who are doing big number work. And that's because it's a parallel processing monster. It doesn't just have a hefty, huge multi-core processor in it. It's also got these dual GPUs that are parallel processing engines as well. So the Mac Pro isn't the sort of thing that you can get and play Battlefield 4 on at really high frame rates. It's the sort of thing that you can get and make models for Battlefield 4 with really realistic 3D visualization. It's a different kind of math. It's a different math problem that Apple's trying to solve with the Mac Pro, but it does it really well. And besides being 1/8 the volume of the previous Mac Pro, it's completely flash-based, so it's fast as hell. It's got 6 Thunderbolt 2 ports on it, so you can expand it with up to 3 4K displays, and you can also hook up RAIDs to it or exotic networking. Like, you can even Thunderbolt bridge it to another Mac Pro if you wanted to build out a server render farm, which I'm sure that Pixar has done with theirs, because they've been using these things for months. So it's a really, really nifty piece of hardware, and you're right, it's an object of lust for me, although I'll be the first to say I have absolutely no justification to own one. But still, it looks like a cool toy.
So here's the thing for me. When I sort of step back a bit, Apple, this is what I like so much about Apple. That's why right now I believe that Apple is the company that is best aligned with my interests as a consumer. They don't just keep doing. They don't just a lot of companies. I can go and maybe this is wrong, but I bought Dells for years, and every year the next Dell was pretty much the same as the last Dell. And yes, I could configure it any way that I wanted, but that's because it was literally Lego blocks inside. It was this sister board going into this motherboard. You pick your modem, and that comes at a price. That configurability comes at a price of size and inefficiency and all these things. And Apple gives you very few options, but they use that ability to really push the envelope and to ask interesting questions. A couple of years ago, they said, we have this MacBook. What if we just take everything and flatten it out? Take that stuff apart, spread it wide. How thin could we make it? And the result was the MacBook Air. There were things that used to be in drives were just chips on a board, and it was a fantastic result. And yes, they could have taken the old cheese grater Mac Pro, and they could have put PCIe flash storage in it, and they could have put great graphics cards in it. People would still have bought it, but they're like, what if we take a CPU, 2 GPUs, we make them around a thermal core? How much smaller could it be if we get rid of everything that you don't absolutely need, the same way we've done with our other Macs, make them into appliances and not these big serviceable boxes? What can we achieve? And now you have this little tiny computer. If you haven't seen it, I'll link to Dan Frakes' slideshow from Macworld to show you just how small this thing is. You have an incredibly powerful computer that you can put on top of your desk, not under it. And I like the fact that nobody else is doing this kind of stuff. Nobody else controls the end-to-end processes as much, but nobody else is willing to take the risk. They're not structured in the same way where this makes any sense to their business whatsoever. And I don't think they'll make a killing on this, Peter, but I like that they're putting awesome ideas out there and they're pushing the state of the art of computing forward.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing. When last week we ran a piece about trying to build a PC-like Mac Pro, doing it yourself, and the fact of the matter is that nobody who's done these things has actually been able to build anything that's the equivalent of the Mac Pro, because some of the parts that Apple puts in the Mac Pro are very, very specialized. But even a rough approximation of the Mac Pro as a do-it-yourself PC is something that actually costs a lot more than the Mac Pro does. So, the spurious nonsense that you've heard over the years about an Apple tax is just that. It's in point of fact, Apple has priced this thing very fairly for what it can do, but they have really relooked at the way that these devices work and figured out what's essential, what's not, cast out that which is non-essential, and the Mac Pro is what remains. The interesting thing is, you were talking about having an upgradable box. Well, we've come to find out that the new Mac Pro may be a little bit more upgradable than we thought. A couple of sites like iFixit and Otherworld Computing and so on have done teardowns of the Mac Pro, and they're finding that although all of these parts are very specialized, there is some upgradability there. For example, the CPU is socketed, so it's conceivable somewhere down the road that you're going to be able, if you buy a Mac Pro today, that you're going to be able to get new components for it that are going to be able to do that are going to be able to run that machine faster or do more specialized things. Although I think with Apple it's never a good idea to count on upgradability, and the fact of the matter is upgradability matters to a very microscopic percentage of users. The vast majority of people, and for that matter corporations that buy computers, don't continually upgrade them. They replace them after a few years. It's as simple as
like that analogy I made. If you have a Lamborghini Countach, you don't upgrade it. You buy the Murcielago, or you buy the Aventador, or whatever, the Reventon, whatever car. You're not buying a hyper vehicle, a hyper concept to upgrade it. People who can afford it will probably buy the new one anyway, and those who can't, it's so powerful that it will last you for years anyway.
That's precisely right, and that's why I said that when the first rumors about the upgradability of the Mac Pro began to leak out, I said, you can replace the CPU on a Mac Pro, or doing that is like saying, I can upgrade my four-cylinder engine to a V8. It's entirely possible that you might be able to do that, but the question isn't whether or not you can. It's how feasible is it, and what is the end result going to be once you're there. So I think that it's another point of criticism for people to look at, saying, it's a black box, you're not going to be able to do anything with it. I don't really think that anybody who's in the market for a Mac Pro gives a damn how upgradable it is, quite frankly.
You dance with the Mac Pro that brought you.
Exactly right.
Well, what year is yours? I mean, mine's an
08.
Yeah, mine's a 10, I think. And it's still, I'm still not using it all its capacity.
No, absolutely. I think the only time I've ever pegged the processors is when I run Handbrake and rip a DVD. That's about it. That's the only time I see it pegged. But I mean, most of the time, I mean, okay, yeah, if I'm doing some video editing or if I'm doing something else on it, that'll peg out the processors as well. But my O8 keeps trucking along. And look, I've made some changes to it over the years. I boot off Flash now. I got rid of the hard drive. I've upgraded the video card on it a couple of times. I've had to replace the optical drive on it because it stopped working. But it continues to truck away. 5 years after I got it, almost 5 years now, because I got it in like February or March of '08.
You have that my precious look in your eyes right now, Peter.
Well, yeah, it's a beloved machine because it's the last of the big iron that Apple has sold. And I mean, for those of us that have been around the market for a long time, that it harkens back to the era of the 2FX or the Quadra 950. These massive NuBus machines that stood 2 feet off the desk and were these towering behemoths. And I have to admit, it appeals to my nostalgia as a 27-year Mac veteran.
When I got my Nehalem Mac Pro, I was working in enterprise, and we had a server room that was filled with digital alphas and all the AIX boxes, and I forget what HPUX boxes. Basically, any large, powerful computer you can imagine, and Dell servers, everything. When I opened the Mac Pro for the first time, it took my breath away because the insides, as much as the iconic outsides haven't changed, what they managed to do with the inside, with just being able to pull out drive bays and the CPU heat sinks and the way the graphics cards were positioned, it was unbelievable to me at the time.
Absolutely. And it's still kind of a marvel, actually, for me when I pop mine open and I can still, pop out the SATA drive bays and, put something new in there or put in more memory, which I've done a couple of times and so on. It's one of the nicer machines that I've had to work on compared to some of the knuckle bleeding experiences I've had upgrading PCs over the years. Good God.
Back in my day when the Mac Pro wasn't Darth Vader's helmet.
Exactly.
So at least as far as I'm going, Peter, there was a lot of interesting stories this year. There were a lot of them that involved far beyond Apple. I spent some time with Georgia Dow, the host of Zen and Tech, on our Vector podcast, talking about things like NSA surveillance, about how social networks have become social mobs, and about how we're both bored with the stuff we have, but scared of the stuff that's changing. So if you want more of what I think are the biggest stories of 2013, I would suggest you look that up, and I will put it in the show notes. Anything else huge to you in Apple this year, Peter?
Well, we've talked about Mavericks, we've talked about iOS 7, we've talked about the new hardware. We've waxed nostalgic and rhapsodic about the Mac Pro. I think we've covered our bases, but let's talk about some of the stuff that's been orbiting Apple this year, because God knows there's been a lot of interesting stories about the various and sundry companies and services that service Mac and iOS users alike. All right, so you're making me immediately want to start talking about the future a little bit, so I'm going to try and wrap all of this together. Sure.
Apple acquired a bunch of companies. They always say when they acquire companies that they do this from time to time, and it shouldn't be taken as any indication of any forward-looking plans. They acquired a lot of interesting stuff this year, and we're looking forward to 2014 now. And I'm always cautious when we talk about the future because I think there's a huge amount of expectational debt that gets placed upon Apple, sometimes by journalists, sometimes by enthusiasts, but we set ourselves up for a lot of disappointment. Apple is a company bound by the laws of economics, of thermodynamics. They're going to do to some extent this year what they did last year, in that whether or not I have inside knowledge about this, I guarantee you there will be an iPhone 6 this year.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty safe bet to make.
And to me, so there's three sort of things in this, and I wrote about this. There's sort of the rumors that you can talk about, but the earlier are out. So Apple's probably not going to renew the iPhone until the fall. So no matter how much we may know about it now, there's so much that can change by then. it sort of creates so much baggage to talk about exclusively rumors at this point. You can also sort of do, Peter's famous line, look at the past as prologue and say, what did Apple do last year? Will they do something similar this year? And you can also do that sort of interesting Johnny Ive thing where you can say, this is a problem that Apple needs to solve, and they are uniquely positioned to solve this kind of problem, and then try to figure out an Apple approach to solving it. And that's incredibly interesting, but it's sort of unreliable at the same time. And I guess the most obvious one, Peter, is this year, and I didn't mention it, one of the most impressive things to me was the iPad Air and the iPad Retina Mini, being able to get that many pixels into devices that thin and that long-lasting. But people are still talking about, sometimes complaining, sometimes wondering about screen sizes. And I don't know if Apple... I know there are a lot of phones that are between 4 and 5 inches, some between 4 and 6 inches, and I know some people have been talking about 13-inch tablet sizes and other varieties. Do you think that's a problem Apple has to solve, and do they have to solve it this year?
Well, Rene, when we've talked about it on the show before, you brought up a very good point, and that is that it's squarely a niche product for those of us who have computers on our desks. But in many parts of the world, people's mobile device is their only link to the internet. And for those people especially, having a big device has a lot of appeal because all of a sudden it's not just a phone, it's a computer in my pocket that can do all this other stuff. My family and I can watch video, streaming video, and be entertained. Or I can look at big pictures. I can take big pictures. I can do all this other stuff with my phone, and it's so much more than a phone. So all of a sudden, with that understanding, I think the perspective on things like the Galaxy Note 3 takes a very different view, and I can't dismiss it. I see a few people using those too, but there's still, maybe one in I don't know how many.
They're more popular in Asia and emerging markets where you can only maybe have or only want one primary computing device, and it being a computer is more important than it being a phone, but it still has to fit in your pocket.
I think that the $50,000 question is, what market is Apple going to disrupt next? That's the question that's been on the mind of analysts for years now, really ever since the iPad was released in 2010. And if you look at Apple's track record, back in 2001, they sort of reinvented the way that MP3 players worked with the iPod, and they set the tone for how that market was going to change and really own the market for quite some time. And then in 2007 they introduced the iPhone, and once again completely reshaped the way that smartphones looked. You can't compare smartphones before and after without looking at the iPhone and realizing what a profound effect it had. Before, they were thumb-based keyboards on Blackberries, and afterwards, Trios, and afterwards, the evidence kind of speaks for itself. And
so let me ask you this then, just to sort of put some focus on it. The Johnny Ive's goal is to make a better product. Tim Cook's goal is to sell more iPhones. Do they need to? Would making a bigger iPhone either make it a better product or let them sell more, or because people just seem to demand change even where it's not needed, at least make it perceptibly different in people's minds enough to refresh the product?
I don't know. I mean, I think that I think that Apple is in the unfortunate position of having to do something completely new. I don't think that refreshing is necessarily going to help keep the public focus on Apple the way that anybody would like it to.
So if we want to talk, let me just get iPad. Well, actually, we'll come back to iPads because I think that's an interesting question. The stuff about new product lines, it's not clear to me. Like, it's clear to me where Apple could, where they have the skill set and the talent to disrupt, but it's not evident to me that those categories would move the needle for them, that those are as big. For example, MP3 players at that time were huge. That became hundreds of millions of shipped products, billions of dollars. Everybody needs a phone. The world is going to be a mobile world, and phones are going to be the centerpiece of that. Tablets are nice. They might one day supplant a large portion of personal computing. They might be a very large business for Apple, but it was something that Apple could do extremely well. If we talk about something like watches and wearables, it remains to be seen how big that market is, and Apple doesn't usually enter a market early. Usually Apple waits until there are several crappy versions of a product, really bad MP3 players, really crappy phones, or horrible, a decade of horrible tablet PCs, and then they know how they can make a better product. And it's not clear to me that we have enough crappy wearables on the market yet that Apple will know the market's ready for them to enter.
Yeah, but we have a good sense that wearables are an important market, or we wouldn't have done what we did this past week.
Well, so we launched smartwatch fans, and that's absolutely true. And Apple is working on an iWatch. I just worry that let's say Apple releases an iWatch later this year, and it's a great product. I don't think it's going to do for its business what the people who demand mega summer blockbusters from Apple want. Like, it's not going to be an iPhone class product, at least not initially.
No, I agree with you, because but that Rene may just be a lack of imagination on our part for what Apple's going to come out with, because we keep saying it's not going to have the impact on the market that maybe some people expect it to, but we're also having trouble imagining what Apple is going to bring to the market that's fundamentally different than what Pebble has done, or what Galaxy Gear has done, or what the Fitbit has done. When all these devices are wearable, all these devices sort of serve a different function, we really don't have a clear idea what Apple's working on. But I'm reminded of something that Steve Jobs said a number of years ago, which is that, and I know I'm paraphrasing here, but that it's more important to provide users with the product that does what they need it to do, as opposed to what they're asking for.
All my customers would have wanted is faster horses.
Right, exactly. Or more dogs for the sled. In your particular case, but it's.
Well, so here's the thing for me.
It's a tough call.
So here's the thing for me is that Apple makes two different kinds of products. They make things like the iPhone and iPad, which are primary businesses. Those are the things that get to be called legs on their stool and get a lot of attention and make a fortune. Mm-hmm. But they also make a lot of products, and the Apple TV, I think, is the best example, where in and of itself it is not a huge business for them, but it allows them to extend their primary business into another sector. Like this, the Apple TV lets you take everything from your iPhone or iPad or iPod and push it into your living room. And I would not be at all surprised if the iWatch, or whatever Apple calls it, starts off as that kind of business, a hobby where they're pulling a thread, they're testing the waters, they have intense interest in it, and all it does is project iOS onto your wrist, sort of like iOS in the car is going to do in the dashboard of your car, and it lets Apple increase the value of their entire ecosystem, not necessarily by having another huge blockbuster product, although it could be that, but by making everything else way more valuable.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, if you take a look at Apple TV as a practical example, what does Apple TV do that the Roku doesn't, or that the Chromebox doesn't? Well, not really a lot. I mean, it's got its own application, sure, and it's tied into the iTunes ecosystem, which is nice. But the killer app for the Apple TV is its interconnectivity with other Mac product or Apple products. The fact that you can stream content so easily from your iPhone or from your iPad or from your Macintosh adds some value not just to Apple TV but to those other products as well. And all of a sudden, it's really simple to bridge that connection between your TV and the devices that you've got in your pocket or on your lap. And I think that that's really the secret to Apple's success, is building out these. I'll use the word again, even though it's kind of a hackneyed marketing term. These synergies between devices and between platforms. And if they're going to do that with a watch, that is a much more interesting equation for me. me than just having a watch for the sake of having a watch. As far as having a larger or smaller iPad, well, Rene, I mean, as you know, and as our frequent listeners know, I spend my weekends working in an Apple store, so I've got, I think, a pretty, not an Apple retail store, but an Apple specialist, sort of a different thing. I have never once had one of my customers say, I want a bigger iPad. So I don't see the point of the iPad
Wait a minute,
Pro.
you're in Cape Cod. Shouldn't someone have said, hey, we're going to need a bigger iPad?
Right, yeah, you would think either, Quinn would come walking through the door saying that, or, one of my many
Screens black as coal.
or one of my many elderly customers with poor eyesight problems. But you know what? For them, the iPad is about as big as they want. The iPad Air is about as big as they want. A 10-inch screen is big. You get anything bigger than that, you're getting into laptop territory. Now, if you're talking about taking a Retina display screen and putting it in a 13-inch form factor and maybe fitting it to the MacBook Air, that's a different story. That's something I think that a lot of people would want. But I just don't see the need for an iPad Pro. I don't think it's an interesting product.
Chris Umiastowski, our stock analyst at Mobile Nations, did an interesting piece for us over the weekend where he said just exactly that he doesn't really see a place in his life for an iPad Pro or a 13-inch iPad, but he is really interested in Apple TV. And if you pay close attention to the Apple space, there's some really good talent working on the Apple TV project now at Apple. And that is something that the Apple TV hardware hasn't been updated since 2010, and that's when it went to 1080p. And it's not clear to me whether they need to go to 4K or anything like that, but it is clear that there's a lot of things that could be going on there. And that's when I was jokingly using those Tim Cook lines about, pulling on the thread and intense areas of interest. But there's a lot that they could do with that box. They have been adding channels. It did get its own version of iOS 7, but it hasn't gotten a new interface yet. We've heard word of an SDK, but that seems to be up on the blocks in Cupertino's driveway right now. But even Chris's thing was a game-only SDK where you could start turning that into at least some form of gaming device with maybe its own controller, maybe made for iPhone controllers, maybe iPhones and iPads. But I think there's something definitely there, and I think Apple is putting more attention on it than they used to.
Yeah, we can see some of the bits of it, and we've actually been able to see some of the bits of it for a while. With the Apple TV, if you're streaming from your iOS device or even from your Mac, you can play games on your TV. I do this with customers all the time. I'll take a simple app that maybe has a single control and throw it up on the TV, and they can immediately see, oh my God, my 5-year-old grandson is going to love doing that, when he comes over, or I could totally see my kids playing on their iPhones on the TV that way. So the application is in point of fact there. It's just not well suited for everyone because streaming content from the iOS device to the Apple TV introduces a little bit of lag. That's never good when it comes to gaming, so it's only really suitable for a very specific casual gaming experience. I
used to play letterpress over AirPlay.
There you go. It's fun to do. It's honestly fun to do, but I don't think it's the sort of thing that's going to give the guys at Sony who are doing the PlayStation 4 or the Microsoft Xbox One team. I don't think that they're shaking in their boots right now because it's not that experience. It's something very different.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. And there's so many. Apple's got partnership plays here. I mean, every channel that's on there is a deal that Apple has made. And it's the same thing with Siri. Every service that Siri can access is a deal that Apple's made. And once you make an SDK and an API, you start to have, that takes all the value out of your partnerships, but it also increases a lot of chance for collision for similar things trying to do it's the same thing at the same time. So it's going to have to be carefully managed. But again, I think that is something that I would pay more attention to. We still haven't seen the Haswell Mac Mini, Peter, and we still haven't seen the fabled Apple Retina iMac or Retina 4K Thunderbolt display. Do you think we have any odds of that, any chance of that in 2014?
Absolutely. I would put my money on it happening, at least for the Retina Mac. I mean, the Retina Mac Mini. Yeah, that would be cool. The Haswell Mac Mini happening sooner rather than later. You know, the thing that I have to reemphasize when it comes to the Mac Mini is that the Mac Mini shares the same mechanical design, the same electronic design as the 13-inch standard MacBook Pro, the non-Retina MacBook Pro. They're kissing cousins, as it were. That machine was, in point of fact, not refreshed in 2013, and that is why I think the Mac Mini wasn't refreshed in 2013, because there was nowhere really for it to go. My suspicion is that that particular device, the MacBook Pro, the 13-inch MacBook Pro, standard MacBook Pro, is probably, you know, headed for obsolescence. I don't think it's going to be refreshed again. You know, Apple's pushed the price of the Retina MacBook Pro down into and quite frankly, the 13-inch standard is just kind of crowding that space a little bit. But Apple has to do something with the Mac Mini because it's a solid seller. It's a solid seller for people who are making a Mac purchase for the first time because it's Apple's least expensive machine. It's only $599. Not only that, but it's enormously popular as a small to medium business server and a workgroup server. Those are markets that Apple is not just going to walk away from. So the Mac Mini, I feel very safe in saying, is going to continue for some time to come. The big question is whether or not Apple is going to take the opportunity to do a radical redesign of the Mac Mini in the same way that it did the Mac Pro. If it did, that opens up all sorts of possibilities. It's got my head spinning.
Well, we joke because like when I started hearing about the new Mac Pro, I kept calling it the Mac Mini Pro because it was so small, and some people took that to mean the Mac Mini was going to become the Pro, but it's really that the Mac Pro was going to be so small. But it does show just what Apple is capable of putting into boxes that size now.
That's absolutely correct, and you know, as small as the Mac Mini is, you know, Apple could radically redesign that and shrink it even further.
Is it PCIe yet on the Mac Mini? I don't think so, right?
No, nope.
So if you imagine a Haswell Mac Mini with PCIe storage, that would be a hell of a server device.
It really would. It would be a lot of that would be a game changer. That would be very disruptive.
The density. So one of the, I mean, people complain in some ways that these are sealed, you know, hermetically sealed packages now, but the density of computing that Apple is able to achieve, the amount of stuff that they're fitting in really small packages, is sort of boggling of the mind at this point.
Yeah, they've got engineers with really tiny fingers, I think.
Elven engineers.
Elven engineers, that's exactly right.
Those Keebler guys have got a heck of a hiring policy.
It's actually that weird magnetic stuff that they use on Krypton in Man of Steel.
Nice, well played. So sort of the last thing I wanted to touch on is our editors awards. We do them every year. It takes a long time to get them done. If you're not familiar with the process, we take all the staff of iMore, some of the staff of Mobile Nations, and we all vote on what we think is the absolute best stuff of the year. Whatever gets the most votes ends up being our choice. And this year, you know, our tech team, Derek Kessler, Jose Negron, they did a gorgeous job of making a nice template for it. We posted it up, I believe it was yesterday, and I just wanted to highlight some of the things on there, and I'll do the iOS ones, and then I'll hand it over to Peter for the Mac ones. But iOS device of the year was the iPad Air, and I think well-deserved, Peter, because the iPhone 5S, yes, it was forward-thinking. I'm still deeply in love with Touch ID. The camera is magnificent. The A7 processor is a beast, but the iPad Air was the only Apple device this year that I couldn't believe was real. It gave me the same feeling as the original iPhone 5. I picked it up, and it was just so light, I thought someone had handed me an empty prototype.
It is a real amazing piece of machinery. I mean, Apple not only trimmed quite a bit of almost half an inch of depth off of it, but they got rid of almost half a pound of weight, or about, what, a third of a pound of weight. So it's definitely, you know, altogether a completely reinvented device.
It's the kind of thing that makes science fiction shows jealous of reality.
Yeah, there you go.
Our iOS feature of the year was just-in-time multitasking, and I mentioned it earlier. And what's impressive to me about this is you have a huge trade-off in mobile. In desktop, you can, especially if you're plugged into a power outlet, The usual thing is just to since the invention of preemptive multitasking is just to let every task run all the time whenever it wants. And that's gradually changing. Mavericks does some changes on that now. But on mobile, that never really made sense. There have been multitasking operating systems, but they had crappy task managers. The battery life was terrible. There were all sorts of compromises. Apple's compromise was just not to let non-Apple apps run in the background. But with iOS 7, they did something really clever. They realized that to people like us, we don't care how often Twitter is checking messages or how often something is being updated, as long as it's updated just before we need it. This is sort of just-in-time backgrounding. It can go a day without checking something, but if it knows I'm going to check it when I wake up in the morning, it's got to have it ready and waiting for me. And what that does is it gives you the perception of total multitasking, but almost none of the negative battery effects that come with it. So with coalescing timers and coalescing network connections and trying to figure out intelligently when you check certain apps every day, this to me gives us the best of both worlds. It's not perfect yet, Peter, but I believe this is the way forward. I think all mobile devices are going to do some variation of this soon.
For sure.
Our app of the year, iOS app of the year, Duolingo. I first saw this app when I walked in on my 5-year-old godson sitting on the couch using his iPod Touch to teach himself Italian. And I was so impressed with that. It's actually funny. Once he said, like, this is really hard, and I listened to it, and it was Mandarin. He'd switched it to, or Portuguese or something. But he could teach himself another language, and that's the future I've always wanted.
That's pretty amazing.
And game of the year, and you're probably more familiar with this than me, but it's Badland, and it's an endless runner. It's physics-based. That in and of itself is not innovative, but the art style, the way they've rendered it, the behavior and gameplay they've put into it, Peter, the minute I saw it, my eyes lit up, and it didn't stop until I had crashed and burned several times.
Yeah, Badland is a really interesting looking game. The art is almost reminiscent of Don Bluth style animation, like the Black Cauldron, or that sort of thing. It's got a very sort of foreboding, dark look to it that I really love. It's a gorgeous game to play.
The Mac of the year, and I'm just going to give you my opening line on this and then hand it over to you, is not innovating anymore, Phil Schiller's ass.
Indeed, yeah. No surprise to anybody who pays any attention to what Rene and I have to say. Mac Pro, definitely the Mac of the year. It is a major step forward for OpenCL-based computing. Open Compute Language is the language that you need to be able to work with in order to make the processors and the GPU, or the processor and the dual GPUs on the Mac Pro sing. Apple's already updated Final Cut Pro with thorough OpenCL optimization. Other companies are stepping forward with their OpenCL apps, and we're going to see a lot more stuff optimized for the Mac Pro in the new year. The Mac OS X feature of 2013 has to be energy savings for all the reasons that we outlined earlier in this podcast. Timer coalescing AppNap. They work together to try to get the most out of the least amount of energy on your machine as possible. And one of Rene and my favorite features is battery shaming. If you've taken a look at your energy saver menu item, you might notice that OS X Mavericks now tells you when an app is using an excessive amount of memory, and it's already caused me, in a couple of cases, to drop developers a line and say, "Hey, what's going on here?" And usually, I get a response back going, "Yeah, you're not the first user to tell us that there's a problem. We're working on it." So if it makes people, behave better in Mavericks, I think that's great. Mac app of 2013 goes to Napkin, which is not the kind of application that everybody needs, but if you do this sort of thing, Napkin is wonderful, and that is making great-looking diagrams. We here at iMore use Napkin for our how-tos. Makes it very easy to show people what they need to know in order to do things. Very useful application.
The one thing, if I can just add one thing about Napkin, and I have to disclaim that the guy English who co-hosts Debug with me is one of the developers behind it. That notwithstanding, it's still a good app. Hi, Guy. The thing about Napkin that really impressed me is that I've worked in Photoshop for 20 years. I can do these diagrams in Photoshop by muscle memory. But I gave this to Ali Kazmua, our how-to editor. I gave this to Georgia Dow, one of our app reviewers, and within an hour, they could make the same quality, the same good-looking graphics in 2 minutes. And the amount of time that saves them and the amount of time it saves me not having to do it. And now, we bought all our own licenses for this. I saw Kevin Michaluk, our chief media officer, he shared his screen with me this morning. He was running Napkin, sending our design department comments on some of the design work they were sending him. It lets anybody make really good-looking stuff quickly, and if time is money, this saved us so much time this year.
Absolutely. So, wrapping things up, our Mac game of 2013 goes to BioShock Infinite, Aspire Media's conversion of BioShock Infinite. The third installment of BioShock, an enormously popular first-person shooter. This one takes us back in time to the turn of the century and takes a very interesting sort of alternate perspective on how the world would have worked if America had been able to build a giant floating city in the sky, and how that would have affected American imperialism of the age.
You know what it reminded me of? I don't know did you ever read Warren Ellis's Authority?
No, actually, I haven't.
I'm going to send it to you because I think the third series, the third issues of 4, it had Sliding Albion, which was a steampunk version of England or an alternate reality invading, and it gave me sort of that vibe.
So yeah, absolutely. If you dig things that are steampunk, and if you are a fan of the BioShock games, BioShock Infinite is just awesome and runs beautifully if you've got a Mac with the horsepower to run it. I also want to mention our runner-up in that particular category because this is a game that has gotten a lot of press and will continue to get a lot of press, The Stanley Parable. If you haven't checked it out already, you can take a look at it on Steam. It's part of their Greenlight program, which gives you access to stuff before it's actually released in its final form. And The Stanley Parable is it's a very odd, very offbeat game that has gotten a lot of great reviews, so please check it out.
Yeah, absolutely. And we have an entire series. We have, Mac productivity app, iOS productivity. There is a whole long list of our favorite devices, applications, and even accessories. We have some great stuff in there, like the Pencil by 53, the Sonos Play 1, all sorts of stuff. We'll have the link in the show notes. Check it out, or you can just go to iMore.com. It's in a big banner at the top. Peter, 2014 has begun.
Yes, indeed, and there's a blizzard outside my house to prove it.
It's minus 27 Celsius here right now. I went to the gas station to fill up my car, and the LCDs wouldn't change state.
Why do we live where we do, Rene?
We could just keep walking down to Florida. I do not know. They even have better barbecue, I'm told.
Ah, well, we'll have to camp out on Phil Nickinson's doorstep someday.
Eat some fish tacos. So next week we will not be here. I will be at CES. Peter will be manning iMore HQ. But we'll be doing about 5 hours of video every day from the show floor, including a Mobile Nations podcast every day. So if you want information right from CES, there's no better place to be. Just look for the hashtag CES Live. In the meantime, Peter, Happy New Year.
Happy New Year, Rene, and Happy New Year to all of our viewers and listeners out there.
Yeah, everyone in the chat room, thank you so much for joining us. People were asking us questions. We're doing questions in the Google Hangout now, so if you ever have them, just throw them in there during showtime, and we're happy to answer them. In the meantime, everyone, have a fantastic 2014, and we will see you in two weeks.